Yeah. We're going to give it one more minute.
Can I give a shout out to Camila for her lightning talk yesterday at the C's lightning talk competition? I thought the way that she presented was like super creative and unlike anything I had seen with cartoons, and it made it really fun. So good job, Camila.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alma. I was a little bit worried about the format, especially in this online COVID reality, but I'm so happy that you like it. And yeah.
Yes, and we like shout outs. So thank you for that.
Did you make those cartoons yourself, Camila?
Yes, I spent 1 week doing those, but it was a pleasure because, you know, it was kind of fun and doing a kind of scientific stuff and have a pleasure in the same time is really nice. So yeah.
Yeah, that was super impressive. I really like the one where he like opened up his jacket and like, you know, showed his muscle, but it was the roots.
Yeah.
That was really good.
Thank you so much.
All right. So welcome, everybody. I think we'll get started. Today we have Anthony Vicenti, who's going to be talking to us. He comes from the Data Management Core, and he joined the Data Management Core, we said in October, right? So
Yeah.
been there now for about half a year. And he is a UA alum. So he got his undergraduate degree in math with a minor in electrical and computer engineering from University of Arizona. And then he got a master's degree in the statistics graduate interdisciplinary program. And so he has worked with a wide variety of data sets, including genomic data sets, healthcare data sets, business data sets, and clinical data sets. And so that's really the kind of person we need for this particular grant, because we work with so many different types of data sets. So he has got a lot of experience in programming. So he's worked in C and C++, Java, MATLAB, Python, R, and SAS. And he is going to talk to us today about thinking about the data set. So your assignment from last week was to think about what your data set looks like. And so he's going to speak to the different types of data sets that are there that you might have, and the types of analysis that you can do on those data sets. And while he's talking, I'm going to put 4 things for you to think about in the chat with respect to your data set that Anthony kind of talked to me about before just now. And so I want you to take a look at the chat and think about those 4 things as Anthony's giving his presentation. So welcome, Anthony, and thank you very much for taking the time today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Start here with the screen share. Make sure everybody can see the screen. So I'm just going to start with a kind of basic talk about statistical tests, get you thinking about your data, some of the basic things you can do. And then at the end, we're going to wrap up with showing you some of the DMAC things that we're doing. Okay. So first thing you have to think about, what type of data do you have? And we have 2 big types. We have the qualitative categorical, so we're talking about words and letters, versus the numerical or quantitative data. So under this qualitative categorical data, we have 3 subcategories. Nominal data, which is does not have any natural order ranking. Some good examples are red and blue, green colors. You can't really rank them. They have no natural ordering or gender. Compared to ordinal data, it does have an order. So, your education, high school's bachelor's, master's, doctorate, there's an order to that. Quality is another really big ordinal type of data that you can have. So something bad, fair, great. The last thing to think about is whether your data is binary, so pregnancy, yes or no, you win a game, you lose a game. Pretty straightforward, and I know I used to always think, why do I really need to know this? It seems pretty basic, but it's kind of good to get a handle of what this is, because it's really helpful if we're trying to figure out what type of statistical test you can actually use. And then just going on to quantitative / numeric data. So there's two major types here, discrete and continuous. A good example of discrete data is how many students are on their phone during class, 0, 1, 2, 3. You can't have 1.1 students on their phone. So there's a finite number of values. Compared to continuous and a weight, there's a whole range. You can be 150, 150.1 for temperature. So it's important to think which parts of your data fall under which category, and thinking about what your inputs or your predictors are going to be and what your outputs are going to be for what you're analyzing. So the next thing you have to think about is your continuous data normal. So many tests assume normality, and if we have a test that assumes distribution, we pretty much call it parametric. If we don't assume any distributions, we call it non-parametric. There's some quick ways to kind of determine if your data is normal, to take a look at it. There's histograms. It's pretty much the #1 way to get a quick view of whether your data is normal. We can do QQ plots. We have a picture of it over here on the side, and basically see whether the points fall along the line. This is pretty good. You see a lot of the points along the line. Sometimes you'll see it tail out really far. You'll see weird shapes, and you have to question normality. Shapiro-Wilk test is also kind of an official test if you want a p-value of whether your data is normal. I guess I'll slow down a little bit, see if anybody has any questions or any examples of data they might think might be normal from their data sets. Or if not, it's fine. We'll move on. So another important thing to think about is, are your groups independent? So can the data of one group be used to inform the data of another? I think it's really useful to look at these two examples. So if they have a clinical trial where you have a treatment group and a control group that are different people, so knowing how one person responds to a treatment shouldn't really tell you how the control person responds to that treatment, because they're different people, compared to different types of clinical trials where you have measurements of the same person before the drug's taken, then after the drug's taken. So it's dependent on that one person. So someone with, let's say, high cholesterol takes a cholesterol medicine, they're still going to be relatively high afterwards, or most likely, compared to someone who had a low cholesterol at the beginning. Afterwards, they're still going to have a lower relative cholesterol. It's kind of thought, so you can't say it's independent. So with some of these things in mind to think about, we're going to move on to some basic tests we can use. We've probably heard of the 2-sample t-test. And there's a lot of things to think about here, but again, I want to say the easiest way to think about this is to go back to the example. So if we have comparing the means of 2 independent groups for a single continuous numeric outcome. So what's that mean? Let's break this down a little bit. So let's say you're comparing blood pressure for a treatment group compared to a control group, right? So blood pressure is your single continuous numeric outcome. It's continuous, it's numeric. And then you have 2 independent groups. We have the treatment group and the control group. So they're considered 2 categorical groups. There are a few assumptions you have to worry about here. So is your data normal, which we've talked about? Are the groups independent? And there's another assumption of equal variance. So the equal variance assumption is actually pretty tricky, and there are no real there are tests you can use, but they don't work very well. So it's actually recommended that if you're going to do some sort of 2-sample t-test, you actually just go do a Welch's t-test. You end up getting the same kind of results anyways, and you don't have to worry about that assumption of equal variance. And then we have the non-parametric version of this, what we were talking about before, the Wilcox and rank sum test, which basically does not assume normality, but you still have to have independent groups. I'm going to bring up an example data set here. So let's say we're talking about for a treatment group and a control group in Excel, and we have all these blood pressure values. We want to see, does the treatment group have different blood pressure values compared to the control group? And how would you run that 2-sample t-test in, let's say, Excel first?
And the treatment group might be a group that's receiving a medication, right?
Right, right. So let's say they received a medication and the control group received a placebo. It's usually how these sort of things go. So, and then usually, you know, when you have your data in Excel, you'd probably see something like this. I'm not sure how everybody's data looks like or how they have it set up, but this is kind of a typical way to look at it, where you have the values for each in this row. Having it this way makes it really easy to just do equals t dot test. And we're basically just going to select the first row, comma, and then select the second row. And here's where we kind of get to the important parts. So it's going to be pretty much like that for the other tests that we're looking at. What we want to think about, is it a one-tailed or two-tailed distribution? And then basically the difference is, a one-tailed, you're looking at it in one direction. So if you think the medication lowers blood pressure, right, you would do a one-tailed thing that treatment's less than control. If we're not sure, we just want to see, is there a difference, period? We don't have a direction, then we do a two-tailed distribution. So for the sake of this example, we're just going to do a two-tailed distribution to see if there's any difference, period. And when it comes to type, we can see that we can choose from 3 types here. We have 2-sample with equal variance, which is the main t-test we're talking about. But we can also select the 2-sample with unequal variance, which is basically the Welch's test I was talking about before. So I'm going to choose the one where we don't have to assume equal variance. And close it off, and here we have our magical p-value of 0.03. Just in case anybody doesn't know, the typical p-value cutoff is 0.05. So anything below 0.05 is considered statistically significant. So doing this in Excel is fine and dandy, but when you do more complicated things, you want to use more complicated programs. And I'm sure some of you have already heard of R, which is something we're using at DMAC pretty heavily for some of our analysis. So I'm just going to show you how to do this in R from the command line, which is a little scary for people, but we're just going to take it pretty slow. It'll be pretty straightforward, I believe. So the first thing you're going to ask yourself, how do I get this data into R? And it's here. Okay. And it's pretty easy. You pretty much have to name the variable you want to go into it. So this example, we're going to say data 2-sample is the variable that's going to take the data. And all we're going to do is do read.csv. And then the name of the file. In this case, we have it called independent data.csv. We put it in quotes, and there we go. Your data is officially loaded into R. Looks a little scary, but it isn't as scary as you would think. Now to run this t-test, we do t.test. And the way R works is you call the data set first. So we're pulling the data from this data 2-sample. And then we do a number sign and we pick the variable we want. So in our case, we want the treatment that we're looking at. So we just type in treatment, so it's labeled up here. And then we want to compare it to the control. So we just type in the 2-sample data set again, number control. So basically you've loaded, you're talking about these 2 columns right here that you kind of compare. The same way we kind of did in Excel, but we typed it out. And then we also want to include that it is 2-sided. So the variable for that is alternative. So we write 2.sided here. And then we want to see, are we assuming equal variance is the last part? So we can type is var equal to false. We are not assuming equal variance in this case.
So can you explain to me, Anthony, why you're assuming There's no equal variance.
Um, you don't have to assume that. If you have good reason to believe your variance is equal, you can use the equal variance test. I'm just using the non-equal variance test as an example. If you wanted to use the equal variance test, you could do true. It's pretty simple to switch. The reason, again, I like using the unequal assumption is that you end up getting the same power as the other tests, and you don't have to worry about the extra assumption. So a lot of people recommend you just don't even worry about that assumption and just use the large t-test.
Okay.
But in the other hand, too, the normal t-test is pretty strong against a lot of these assumptions if you have a lot of a pretty big sample size. So in this case, we actually have I think it's 50 people in each 100 people total. So that's a pretty decently large sample size to where it might not be that significant. But just for the sake of the example, I'm just assuming that we're not going to do equal variance. And here we go. We get all this, the Welch's two sample t-test that we said we were doing. We come right here, we can find the p-value of 0.0385. And we see that's the same p-value we got in Excel, 0.0385, more or less. I'll look it up for everybody. So basically the same thing. You might want to ask yourself, well, why am I going to do all the trouble of loading up R, getting the data into R, writing this whole mess? And it does make sense for some cases, but there are more things you can do in R that you can't do in Excel. And actually, one of the things I'm about to demonstrate is that the non-parametric test, you have to download a special extension to Excel. And to be honest, I'm not quite sure how to get that all figured out, but I do know in R, it's pretty simple to do the non-parametric version of it where you don't have to assume normality. You just type in Wilcox.test and you do variables, which again, to data sample treatment and to sample control. And that's pretty much it. And then here we go. We have the Wilcox rank sum test, and we see our p-value is actually pretty close to the normal other test. So this test works also well if it's normal. So the only thing we don't recommend using parametric tests like this all the time is because you generally get less power out of them, which means you're not going to find significant results as well. So kind of better to use the actual t-test if you know your data is normal. But if it's not normal and you have some problems with that, this Wilcox test here will pretty much take care of that problem. So it's going back to here. So the other side of the two sample t-test is a paired t-test, which is pretty similar, but we're missing that independence assumption because things are in a pair. So going back to some of the other examples we had, let's say you want to compare blood pressure of the same person before and after treatment. So you're getting two measurements from the same person. So the two measurements are considered a pair. And in this case, we assume that the data is normal and that there's independence between pairs, which means one person isn't the same thing as another person. So in this case, we wouldn't have to worry about that. And then there's the normal version of the non-normal version where we don't have to assume normality is the Wilcox signed rank test, which is basically the non-parametric version of the paired t-test. To do this in Excel, it's actually pretty straightforward. Let me pull up what that might look like if you had that sort of data. So you'd have an individual, right? We'd have, let's say, their blood pressure before and the blood pressure after medication. And so this would be very similar to what you would see, in sort of clinical trials or things that use this sort of layout, sort of design. So again, it's honestly pretty much almost the same as how we did before. So I'm just going to walk through it really quick. T-test. We're going to choose what we're trying to compare, the before to the after. And then we're going to just assume it's two-tailed for now. And so we're just going to pick paired instead of the other two at the end. So it's pretty much the same thing we're doing. And here we get a p-value that is well below 0.05. So the question is, right, does it really matter which test we use, a paired versus the two sample? And it all kind of seems the same, and it can matter. So actually, if we run the same test on this, right, but instead of picking the paired t-test, let's say we say, oh, we just want to do the two sample for everything. We see that we actually get a p-value that's a lot worse. That's not even statistically significant in this case. So you would throw out results using the wrong test under this scenario versus keeping the results and use the right test. So it's kind of important to keep that in mind. Now, it's not always going to be the case. I kind of made the data this way because I generated this myself. So it's kind of the worst case scenario. So I'm not going to tell you that you always are going to get this. You might get, right by lucky, but you should really try to just make sure you use the right test for the right scenarios. And again, I think you can do the non-parametric tests here in Excel, but I think you have to do a lot of extra things. So I'm just going to show how you would do these things in R really quick. And since we've kind of done this already, I'm just going to speed it up. I'm going to call, since it's a new Excel, I'm going to call a new variable here. Just saying read.csv like we've done before. And we have this one is called paired data .csv. And there we go, the data's in there. And it's basically, we're going to take the same type of coding style we did before, t-test, where you pick the two variables. So we have the data pair variable. And here we're looking at before versus after. So we have the $sign for there, $sign after. And then we have some of the same things we have to worry about before. Alternative is going to be equal to two-sided, whether it's two-sided or one-sided. And then at the end, we just type in paired equals true. So note, we don't have to worry about equal variance when we're looking at this. So that is one thing that we don't include here. We just include the pair equals true. And actually, that's not great. And then here we go. We have 2.114. Pretty much the exact same thing we had here, 2.114. For the regular t-test. And the Wilcox test is basically kind of the same as before, where you just type in wilcox.test. But instead of just putting in the variables, you just put in paired is true, like we did before. Pair or after. The only difference here is that pair equals true. And here now we have also a significant p-value, slightly different. But again, if you don't have normal data, R is really nice because we have this very simple one line of how to run this non-parametric test. So just start this again. So another common test you'll hear a lot around is ANOVA testing. And basically what you have here for the simple ANOVA test is multiple independent groups compared to a single numerical outcome. So one good example here is blood pressure of 3 different groups. We have, let's say, obese, overweight, and normal. And how do these blood pressures compare depending on this group? So if you only had 2 groups here, you could use a t-test. But since we have more than 2 groups, we use an ANOVA test. ANOVA tests have the same sort of assumptions, whether there's normal, you assume that everything's independent and that there's equal variance in this between groups as well. So the obese group, the overweight group, and the normal group should have equal variance and be independent of each other. Then there's, again, the non-parametric version of it. So it's kind of the same thing we've seen. There's this version that assumes there's normality. There's a version that does not assume there's normality. And if we wanted to see what that data set would look like in Excel, here we go. We basically have 3 groups now instead of 2. And we have data values associated with each. I want to figure out, is there any difference among any of these? So it's actually what we have to do here is, maybe some of you have done this before, but just going to run through it really quick, is to include an extra package here for Excel. So just go to options, add-ins, down here at Go. You see there's an analysis tool pack you can check mark. And with the analysis tool pack, you can actually go to data here and data analysis and choose ANOVA. And it has a lot of different analysis tools here as well, but we're just considering the single factor ANOVA for today. Input, so you just highlight everything. Output is where do you want the results to go. So I'm going to put them down here. And okay, and there we go. We've run our ANOVA test and we have a p-value. So it's less than 0.05, so we can say that there is a difference between these 3 groups when it comes to blood pressure. If we want to run this in R, just going to copy and paste the code over so we're not worrying about me typing everything. We're going to read in the data again. So we're going to call it data ANOVA this time. And I kind of cheated because I rearranged the data for R. This is one of the small subtleties you have to worry about when you're working with different programs and transform your data to fit R. R likes it like this, where we have the score, the blood pressure score, and the size next to each other. This is how it wants to analyze the data. So transforming it is actually one of the biggest parts of any type of data management, is cleaning your data, transforming it, and making it useful to get inputted.
Is there a way to automate that in R?
Transforming it?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I think there are packages, and I could go through doing things like this automatically and easily. That's kind of a whole topic for another R lecture. But yeah, I do believe there's ways of very easily data managing in R, especially with things like tidyverse. And actually, we're going to see when we do the last example after this that R does do some things for us very well. Yeah, so if we're going to just input this into R, I put this in R, and it's very simple like we have done. We just do this AOV test, and we're just doing, again, the data of the blood pressure. So we have that blood pressure variable here compared to the size. And in R, you'll see the squiggly. So it's basically a Y versus X. So we want to see the blood pressure as our dependent variable. How is that affected by our independent variable, the size? And so we can run this, and the analysis gets saved in this variable. So all we have to do is ask for a summary of that. So what is a summary of our results? And here we get the same thing where we get this p-value, 9.8 times 10 to negative 5. If we go back to our other ANOVA, we got 9.8 times 10 to negative 5. And so we're basically in the same results. Again, with this last, yeah, let's go to the last example and that we have here. And we'll look at a chi-square test and look at maybe why R is sometimes a little bit easier for these basic things. So if you're doing a chi-square test, you're basically looking at a categorical predictor and a categorical outcome. So let's say for one example, are gender and pet preference independent? So you come up with the assumptions like always. I assume categories independent of each other, male versus female. And the one problem with the chi-squared test you have to watch out for is it's very sensitive to having low values in these boxes. So let's say females don't really like other pets for some reason, and you only have 0 or 1 females here. Actually can never be 0, but even if you have low values of 1 or 2 or 3 spread out, it causes some problems with the analysis. And a lot of software will spit out errors telling you that. Watch out for the size you have in these boxes. So just to go towards what that might look like in here. So let's say we have males and we have the pet. So all these males had cat pet or prefer cats, all these males prefer dogs, pretty simple. So in R, you do the rest of what I'm about to talk about automatically. But in Excel, you'd have to figure out how to get the counts, which is actually a whole equation. But I'm just going to put the counts in here to save time. Once you have all the counts here, so 32 males prefer cats, 53 prefer dogs, you actually have to figure out their expected value. And their expected value is basically the total of the column times the total of the row divided by the total of everything. So for a cat, it would be 91 times 96 divided by 200 for the male cat. And you basically see that equation here to get that value. And then here, the spot here, so we take this total of the column and the total of the row multiplied together divided by the total. Once we have these two things set up, we come in here and say equal chi-squared, and we're going to do the chi-squared test. And once we have it set up, it's pretty easy. We highlight the actual data versus the expected data we just calculated, and we should get a p-value here of 0.00642. So it's less than 0.05, so we assume that there is some that's not independent. The gender does play a role in preference of pets. Compared to R, where we wouldn't have to worry about doing all this work, all we'd have to do is come in is load the data, right? Yeah. So if we remember correctly, the data is in a couple lines, but you can use this table function. Again, we're picking out the gender and the pet columns, and it creates this for us. So we got the counts here of each one in one line. And since we have those counts already, all we have to do is type in chi-squared dot test, and then put in the table that we just generated. Paste over. All right. And here we get a p-value 0.00055. It's a little different from Excel 0.0006. I'm not sure if that's rounding, but you basically get the idea. The more complicated it gets, the easier it is in R. And there's a lot of tricks like making this table, and if it only took one line, and it was very simple that R can do that Excel cannot do. So just to leave off on some other points, some things that I wish we could have maybe gotten to that would have taken a little bit more time is logistic regressions. Basically, they're very good for binary outcomes, and they're used in a lot of clinical trials. Death is a big one. So whether someone is alive or not is binary, it's yes or no. And you can have multiple predictors such as BMI or exposure to smoke and all sort of different variables you want to look at. Linear regressions are another example where you can have continuous outcome variables with multiple predictor variables. So if you're trying to look at, let's say, lead levels in blood as your outcome and how that's affected by, let's say, e-cigarette smoke. So you have the continuous outcome variable of blood lead levels, and you have multiple predictor variables. You can put in there age, sex, exposure to smoke. And then you have correlation tests. If you ever have two continuous variables, if you want to check the correlation, Pearson and Spearman are the two biggest correlation tests. So there are lots of tests. There's lots of things you can do. I just covered some of the basics. You can do Excel. You can try doing it in R. If we have any questions before I move on, I'm just going to show some other cool things more related in a general sense to what we're doing. So that command line was pretty annoying. So there's an excellent, wonderful tool that I love called RStudio, which basically is a wrapper over R, and it gives you this nice kind of interface to work with. So I have all the code we just ran all listed up here, and this is where you put your code. And all you have to do to highlight, all you have to do is run it, is highlight it and press run. So this, remember, reads CSV, just reads the data. And then your variables pop up here. And one of the nicest things you can do is just click over here and say, hey, this is what my data looks like. We have the treatment and the control. And I have actually the stuff on the side because I was typing in the t-test in the Excel sheet that it picked up. But we can still do everything we were doing before. And we can kind of look at what the data looks like and what you're playing with instead of just looking at a command line. Basically, if we want to run the t-test again, just highlight it. It's the same code I did in the command line. I just put it in here, and we get our results out here on the bottom, and our p-values right here. And very nice way you're able to control what you run, look at what you have, where your variables are. And if you're going to use R, I'm going to recommend you also get RStudio. Both are free, if anybody's curious. So some analysis that we're kind of doing right now. So for the more complicated things, I'm just going to run it off because it takes a little bit of time. Kind of explain what's going on here. So we basically have reading in this data set of count and log fold change data for genes. And the first step is to clean it. So we're taking out, we're only keeping the significant genes. We have to change the names because one of the most annoying things in bioinformatics type world is that there's different name systems that go to different things. So they come in the gene symbol, but we have to convert it to the entrance IDs. And then we have to remove anything that couldn't be converted. So there's that cleaning done. We have to add a log fold change cutoff, and that cutoff can vary what you want. Right now, it's just anything greater than or less than to 1. And we got to put it together in a variable. And then we actually run the actual analysis here, where we're basically running an enrichment and a GSA analysis, which I could get into what that means. But some of the plots that we can generate from here. So once I've generated all the data, right, it's really easy to make full plots. It's just pretty much one line here. If I want to make a ridge plot, and your plots pop up here on RStudio, which is really nice. And you kind of look at what your plots are in real time. And we're basically looking at the distribution of the log fold change for each of these enriched pathways or gene sets. And we can see that these gene sets down here have, you know, small distribution or doesn't have a lot of variance compared to these up here that do have a lot of variance. We can look at the dot plot here and see which genes have the highest gene ratios. So we have this FEB target genes up here. And then another really cool plot, which is too big to fit in my RStudio, but we're gonna run it anyways and save it real quick. I'm just gonna export it as a PDF. And pull it up. Computer's up and slow. Where we can look at the relationship between some of these gene sets and specific genes. So here are the big gene sets. And for example, we can look at this gene right here, this CDYL2, and see that's actually interconnected with these 3 gene sets. So it's cool visualization tools, and doing something like this would be very difficult in Excel. So our goal actually is, so we do all that. So I had to do all this code. I had to import the data. I had to clean it. I had to pick the log fold change. I had to pick the analysis options. I had to pick the plots. I had to do the right plot settings. We want to streamline this. So where all people have to do is input their data, and we clean it for them. We fix it for them. we lay out easy buttons and easy options for them to pick, and they just pick options and they get to look at all the visuals they want, and any type of analysis that they want to run. We're planning to do a wide variety, but this is actually one of the ones that we're going to release here soon, where we're looking at this, gene enrichment and gene pathways. Which kind of the overview of the sort of things that we are doing in DMAC. Yeah, so that's pretty much most of it. So if anybody has any questions, I can open it up. I think you're muted. Yeah.
I'm glad we recorded this because people can go back and kind of go through it a little more slowly. But Anthony is available to any of you to consult on your data sets, right? So he could actually help you choose how to analyze your data set and define what your data set is. So that's one of the reasons we have a data management core in the Superfund program. So
I'm always here to help with analysis. Yeah, so just feel free to email me any questions you have. If you want to look at your data, look at the test. If you have any questions on cleaning, like we had a question on whether we can easily transform data into different inputs in different ways, just let me know and we can look into ways of looking at your data.
So are there any questions? How many of you have, raise your hands, how many of you have data sets that are nearing ready to go? Ben, Camila, Kendra. Okay. Good. So again, we have colloquium next week at 4 o'clock, and Dr. Ekseng Oy and Nirav Merchant will be presenting on sort of the interface that you guys are building, right?
Right. So basically, the analysis I just showed you with a very easy interface for people to use.
Right. And so it's important that you come to colloquium next week because that's the sort of follow-up on this. This is sort of the nitty-gritty of what you're doing when you analyze. And that will be about the interface that will be available for you to use. And again, we've put a lot of time and effort and thought and resources into the data management core. And so it's something that you guys should take advantage of and should make sure your advisors know that they can take advantage of as well. So thank you, Anthony. I learned a lot.
Okay.
Statistics is not my strong point, but
there's a lot that goes into it, and there's a lot to think about. And I know there are a lot of packages out there that do things for you, but there's always kind of a way to make sure that it's doing what you think it's doing, to kind of know some of the background of some of the assumptions.
I actually think that's the scariest thing about statistics is are you using it appropriately, right?
Right.
And I think that's one of the nicest features of having the data management core, because you guys can make sure that you're doing your statistics correctly, right?
Right. That's the biggest reason why we're here, in my opinion, at least.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Thank you for coming. Again, thanks, Anthony. That was great.
All right. And again, like I said, feel free to email me if you have any questions.
Sounds good. Bye. See you next week.
Thank you. This was helpful.
Wow.
I know.